The vibration of my phone cut through the quiet of the house. A sharp, insistent buzz that made my chest tighten before I even unlocked the screen. A bank alert. For years, that account was untouchable. Sacred almost. It was my father's last gift to me. The college fund he built before he died. And my mother swore no one would ever touch it. My hands went cold when I read the words on the notification. Withdrawal, $28,000. I couldn't breathe. My acceptance letter was still magnet pinned to the fridge. The tuition deadline circled in red Sharpie on the calendar. That account was my ticket. My proof that the promises made after my father's funeral meant something. But in one move, nearly everything was gone. I stumbled into the hallway, lightheaded. The creak of the stairwell gave him away. My stepfather, coming down, casual as ever, yawning. I confronted him right there in the kitchen, my voice trembling. "Where's the money? Tell me you didn't touch Dad's account." He opened the refrigerator, as if I hadn't spoken, then finally turned to me with a smirk. "Relax," he said, his tone irritatingly calm. "I moved it. It's for your own good. College isn't what you think it is." My skin burned with a heat that had nothing to do with anger alone. I was humiliated, reduced. He didn't even flinch as he admitted what he'd done. He poured himself a glass of orange juice, sipping it while I drowned in shock. I wanted to scream at him, shake the truth out of him, but I froze, torn between devastation and disbelief. Because here's the ugly part. My mother was upstairs, asleep, and I knew that if I woke her, he'd spin me into looking hysterical. That's his gift, flipping the script so I'm the irrational child, and he's the rational adult. But $28,000, gone with one smug explanation that it was better off. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control, about him deciding my path without asking me. And in that moment, I knew I was standing at the beginning of something I couldn't just swallow. But was I ready to explode it all open? I kept staring at his glass of orange juice, the condensation dripping down, until I realized the next move had to be mine. But the question was, how far was I willing to go to save the future he thought he could rewrite? Shall I write the next chapter? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red-circled tuition deadline on the calendar, mocking me, almost pulsing like a timer counting down. Morning light draped across the house, suffocatingly normal, while my entire future dangled in limbo. I could hear the radio in the kitchen playing softly, my mother humming under her breath as if nothing had happened. Did she know? Did he tell her? Or was I walking into a trap where I'd be made to look ungrateful the second I opened my mouth? I wanted to believe my mother couldn't possibly stand by if she knew he had drained the account. That fund wasn't his. It was sacred. Something my father had set up before the cancer ate him alive. I still remembered the night Dad signed those papers, sliding them across the table with a proud smile. "This," he told me, "is my way of making sure you've got choices. No one can take that away from you." I was 14. I had believed him with my whole heart. Now I felt like the floor beneath my life had cracked wide open. Moving out wasn't an option. I had no savings of my own, and until I could pay tuition, my admission would be lost. And losing college didn't mean pressing pause. It meant erasing everything I had worked toward, every late night, every scholarship essay. That college was my shot at freedom. Maybe my only escape from this suffocating house where he had slowly, brick by brick, made himself the master of everything. When I finally confronted my mother quietly in the hallway, her face went pale. She whispered, "Don't make a big scene. Not today." She wouldn't even meet my eyes. I knew what that meant. She knew something, and she was already afraid of him. Control. That was what this whole thing was about. He had wormed into every decision since he moved in. What groceries we bought, how money was spent, even where family photos got hung. And now, with the stroke of a transfer, he thought he could steer my entire life. But there was no pretending this time. No amount of humming to the radio could plaster over the truth. My college fund was gone, and unless I figured out how to fight for it, so was my future. And what I didn't see coming was how he'd start seeding tiny little insults around others, trying to make sure I looked too unstable to be trusted with my own choices. Shall I write the next chapter? It started small, almost too small to call out. That's why it was so clever. At dinner a few nights after the bank alert, when my aunt and uncle came over, he leaned back in his chair and joked casually, "She's got big ideas talking about going off to that fancy school. But you know how girls are, dreamers. Maybe it's better if she stays close, right? Community college would save a fortune." Everyone chuckled politely, and my mother gave me that silent warning glance. "Don't make a scene." I forced a smile, but inside I wanted to throw my fork across the table. That fund wasn't just money. It was my father's voice preserved in numbers, a promise that I wouldn't have to shrink myself just to survive. And now that promise was being rewritten as a punchline. The digs escalated like clockwork. When my cousin mentioned her own scholarships, he chimed in, "Well, some kids can handle independence. Others still need support. It's not a crime to admit you're not ready." He wasn't looking at her when he said it. His eyes were fixed on me. On Sunday, as I walked into the living room, I overheard him on the phone with my grandmother. "She just doesn't understand the realities of money yet," he was saying, his voice dripping with false concern. "We're protecting her from mistakes she'd regret later." My stomach turned. He was building a narrative behind my back, one in which I wasn't the victim of a theft. I was the reckless child who had to be saved from herself. When I tried to call him out privately, to tell him he was twisting things, he laughed in my face. "You're too emotional. You always imagine attacks where there aren't any. I just want what's best." The gaslighting tone made my skin crawl, because I knew exactly what he was doing, eroding my credibility before I could even cry foul. And the cruelest part? It worked. At our next family dinner, when I asked about setting up protections for the remaining money, my uncle chuckled softly and said, "Maybe when you're older you'll understand. Bills don't pay themselves." I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand on the table and yell, "It's my father's money, not his, to touch." But I saw then how carefully he'd set the stage. If I raised my voice, I would look like the unstable one. It was like drowning in slow motion, knowing he was holding me under, and still convincing everyone else it was just a swimming lesson. But what none of them saw was the storm building under my silence, the moment when he'd cross a line so publicly, so cruelly, that not even his show of good intentions could hide it. Shall I write the next chapter? It happened on my mother's birthday. The dining room was crowded with relatives, the table dressed with candles, and my aunt's famous lemon cake. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe the night would pass without him needling me. Maybe, just for once, he'd let it go. But his speeches always came, like storms. You could sense them in the air before the words even started. He tapped his glass. Everyone's chatter died down, and he put on his benevolent smile. "I just want to make a little toast," he began, "to family, to health, and to making choices that protect our loved ones, even when they don't understand at the time." Already my stomach tightened. His eyes flicked toward me, then back to the guests. "You know," he continued, glass raised high, "young people think they know everything about the world. They want to throw money at big dreams. But it's my responsibility to make sure that money isn't wasted. So, yes, I redirected her future a little. Some of you may not agree, but protecting our family's resources comes first. Laughter dripped around the table like poison, but it wasn't warm. It was uncomfortable. My aunt's eyes darted to mine, a flicker of pity sparking there. My cousin suddenly found the rim of his glass fascinating. My face burned hot, every muscle in my body screaming to stand up and shout. Instead, I clenched my fists under the table. I glanced at my mother. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't smiling. She was staring into her plate, motionless, as if she could erase herself from the room. She wasn't defending me, but she wasn't endorsing him either. And that silence, it hurt more than his smug toast. For hours after, his words replayed in my mind. Redirected her future. He didn't even try to hide what he'd done anymore. He wanted people to know. So when I protested later, they'd already have his version in their heads. But what he underestimated was how those words had landed. Some family members looked unsettled. His attempt at control wasn't as neat as he imagined. And I realized, if I could find something concrete, something undeniable, I could break through his facade of responsibility. The line had been crossed publicly now. The only question left was whether I could find proof strong enough to turn his own script against him. Shall I write the next chapter? The morning after that birthday dinner, I woke with my jaw aching from clenching it all night. His redirected her future speech was still looping in my head, each word cutting deeper. I couldn't shake the look on my aunt's face either. That mix of pity and discomfort. Maybe, just maybe, some cracks in his charade were finally visible to others. But before anyone else would truly believe me, I knew I needed evidence. Something impossible to explain away. So I came up with my own plan. I suggested to my mother that we open a shared savings account together, just the two of us. That way, I said gently, we can protect whatever money is left. I watched her eyes soften, her lips part, like maybe I'd found the one angle that might work. For a second, she seemed ready to agree. But then he appeared, as if conjured right out of the woodwork. A new account? He repeated, his voice sharp in a way that made my mother shrink back immediately. He crossed his arms, standing in the doorway with that performative authority he always carried. Not a chance. The rules are already clear. That fund wasn't hers to begin with. She doesn't touch it. My chest tightened. It wasn't yours either, I snapped before I could stop myself. But my mother's warning glance silenced me, fear folding itself neatly across her face. Then he said it, the dagger. I'm her legal guardian, and until she's truly independent, I make the financial decisions. That's the law. It wasn't just a refusal. It was a barricade, a deliberate move to choke any hope I had left. I felt the walls closing in. He had positioned himself in full control. The account, my mother, the story he'd spun for the family. And here I was, once again, painted as the petulant child, asking for candy instead of money earned by my father's sweat. That night in my room, I cried into my pillow, but only until the tears dried into something sharper. He thought he'd locked every door. But what if he had left a window open? I grabbed my laptop, logged into the online bank portal, and started digging. What I found made my pulse nearly leap out of my skin. Not only were there massive withdrawals, but the transfers weren't disappearing. They were landing in a separate account under his name. And then, tucked inside the history, a line item that chilled me, a direct payment made to a private lender. My stomach dropped. He wasn't redirecting my future. He was paying his own debts with my father's gift. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart hammering. There it was, the proof no one could ignore. But showing it would come at a cost. Because if he saw I'd broken the silence, if he knew I had turned the evidence outward, he wouldn't just mock me anymore. He'd rage. So I sat there trembling, knowing I had finally caught him red-handed, but also realizing that once I played this card, there was no way back to the fragile peace that had barely held us together. And I had to decide, was keeping the family intact worth more than my future? Shall I write the next chapter? I couldn't shake the images from my screen. The words on the statement, the dates, the transfers, they etched themselves into my brain like scars. Payment to private lender. Auto transfer to secondary account. Each entry proof that the story he spun to the family about redirecting my future was nothing more than self-serving fraud. For 2 nights, I barely ate. I kept replaying scenarios, showing my mother the evidence and watching her collapse in shame, confronting him head-on and bracing for his rage, forwarding everything to my grandmother or even the bank manager. But with each possibility came the same haunting fear. What if no one believed me? He had already painted me as unstable, emotional, incapable. If I revealed the truth, and they still sided with him, it would mean losing everything, not just the money, but the thin threads tying me to my family. That was when the memory of the birthday dinner came back in brutal clarity. The way my aunt had looked at me, pitying but uncertain, as if she suspected something wasn't right. That small flicker gave me courage. If even one person could see through him, maybe others would too, if I had the courage to break the silence. The breaking point came the following morning, when I overheard him talking to my mother at the kitchen table. His voice was low, commanding. "She's not ready for independence. That money is better keeping this house stable than throwing it away on her childish fantasies." That word, childish. It snapped something in me. I carried those bank printouts in my bag, the proof that I was not a child imagining things. And for the first time in my life, I stopped caring about whether he would explode, whether my mother would beg me to hold my tongue. If staying quiet meant losing my future, then silence was worse than his wrath. I felt the decision set inside me like cement. I would expose him. Not privately, not quietly, but fully, with witnesses present so he couldn't twist it back on me. If I bled, I would bleed in the open, so others could finally see whose hands were really holding the knife. As I lay in bed that night, the papers under my pillow as though they might evaporate if I let them go, my heart hammered faster than it ever had before. Tomorrow, it would no longer be secrets, whispers, and gaslighting. Tomorrow, I would put it all into the light. But if I was going to confront him, I had to choose when and where to strike, and who I wanted to be standing with me when the truth finally exploded across the table. Shall I write the next chapter? The chance came sooner than I expected. That weekend, my mother called everyone together for a Sunday lunch. Just us, my stepfather, and her sister's family. The table was loaded with roasted chicken, vegetables, and bread still warm from the oven. Normally, I would have tried to shrink into the background, but with the papers folded in my bag, every tick of the clock felt like thunder rolling closer. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I barely tasted the food. He was in high form that day, laughing too loudly, telling exaggerated stories about how he kept this household afloat. Each boast was another push into my ribs. Meanwhile, my mother stayed quiet, dutifully clearing plates, a ghost trapped in her own home. I knew if I didn't act now, he'd keep weaving his version of reality until it hardened into fact. My hands trembled under the table as I reached into my bag and pulled out the bank statements, crisp sheets that suddenly felt heavier than stone. "Actually," I said, my voice breaking the chatter, "you don't keep this household afloat. You gutted my college fund to pay off your personal debt." The room froze. My aunt's fork clattered to her plate. My mother's eyes snapped up in panic. And him? He leaned back, smirking, like I'd just set fire to myself. "That's quite an accusation," he drawled, his voice perfectly calm. "You've been reading things you don't understand. I moved money to a safer place to protect it from your impulsive dreams. You think running off to college is worth bankrupting the family? Grow up." My throat burned, but I didn't flinch this time. Wordlessly, I slid the bank statements across the table, the highlighted payments impossible to ignore. My aunt picked them up, her lips moving as she read, her expression turning fast from confusion to shock. I stared at my mother. "Tell me you still believe this is about protecting me." Her face drained of color. She reached for the papers, her eyes skimming the damning lines. The silence was suffocating, broken only by his scoff. "This is exactly what I mean. Dramatic, emotional. She's spinning a child's tantrum into a courtroom trial." But the problem for him was simple. The numbers weren't lies, and his calm arrogance was cracking against them. My aunt's voice cut through sharply, firmer than mine. "These payments, this isn't for the house. This is your debt." For the first time, I saw his composure falter. Just a flicker, but enough. The mask had a fracture. And in that breathless moment, I braced myself. Because if he couldn't twist the truth anymore, there was only one move left for him. Rage. "Shall I write the next chapter?" His chair scraped so hard against the floor, it made everyone flinch. The mask was gone. His voice boomed, full of venom now that charm had failed. "You have no right to humiliate me in my own house." He jabbed his finger at me, face red, veins bulging at the sides of his neck. "Do you think those papers mean anything? I am the head of this family. I decide where the money goes. Without me, your mother and you would have nothing." I felt the air in the room tighten, like everyone's lungs forgot how to breathe. My aunt instinctively put a hand on my mother's arm, steadying her, because my mother had gone pale. She whispered, "Tell me it isn't true," her voice trembling so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. But he didn't answer her. He just kept his glare locked on me, trying to scorch me into silence by force. I met his eyes, and, for the first time, didn't look away. "You're not protecting us. You're feeding on us." On him. My voice cracked, but didn't break. I tapped my finger on the line in the statement showing the lender's name. "My father's savings were for a future. You stole that future and used it to clean up your failures. Don't you dare pretend you're the savior in this story." The room felt like glass about to shatter. My cousin cleared his throat nervously, as if hoping to diffuse it. But then, blessedly, the landline rang. The sound made everyone jump. My mother answered automatically. We all watched her face as she listened, her hand gripping the receiver tighter and tighter until her knuckles went white. When she hung up, her voice was hollow, clipped, but steady. "That was the bank. They called to confirm irregular activity on the account. You opened a credit against it last month." The explosion in his face was impossible to hide now. He lunged to snatch the papers from the table, but my aunt pushed them out of reach and snapped, "Don't you dare!" For once, someone else had stepped into the line of fire, and the balance shifted like gravity changing sides. His shouting spiraled into excuses, that he had to, that times were tough, that I'd squandered it anyway. But every word sounded thinner, weaker, against the bank's confirmation and the evidence in front of us. My mother finally looked him straight in the eyes, something I hadn't seen her do in months, and she said, "Get out." The silence afterwards was louder than any scream. My chest was pounding, my palms damp, but inside me a strange clarity bloomed. This war was no longer mine alone. The truth had landed, and I knew, as he stormed out of the dining room, I'd never look at this house, or my mother, the same way again. But as the door slammed shut, all I could think was, what now? When the dust clears, what's left of a family built on stolen money and half-buried lies? Shall I write the next chapter? The silence after he left was unbearable. My mother was still standing by the phone, her hands trembling, as though she were trying to recall how to hold her own body. My aunt rubbed her back gently, whispering comfort, but my mother seemed unreachable, as if she had fallen into some invisible pit. I sat frozen, the papers lying between us like the wreckage of a crash no one could pretend hadn't happened. I thought there would be relief, exposing him, having the truth break open in front of witnesses. But instead, what I felt was dread. Because truth doesn't just destroy him. It destroyed the fragile stability we had all been surviving under. The image my mother clung to, of a man who protected us, was ripped away. Now there was only broken trust, empty accounts, and the echo of the door he had slammed behind him. That night, the house felt haunted. Every object in the living room was his. The leather chair he insisted we buy. The framed photo he'd positioned at the center of the mantel. The mugs with sayings about family first he always brought home. Each item now felt like part of his performance, props on a stage he had controlled for years. My mother hadn't spoken much since the confrontation. She moved slowly, as though decades had settled on her shoulders in a single evening. I lay awake hearing her footsteps pacing the floor above me. Around midnight, she came into my room. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed red, and she sat on the edge of my bed like she didn't know whether to speak or cry. Finally, her voice cracked through. I didn't want to see it. Every time I felt something was wrong, I told myself I was imagining it. I thought protecting peace was more important than asking questions. And I let him do this to you. That confession was heavier than any scream. I wanted to hug her, but my anger complicated everything. How much did she know? When did her silence start being loyalty to him instead of love for me? Still, watching her unravel made me realize this wasn't only my breaking point, it was hers too. And whatever came next, we'd both be stepping into uncharted ground without him to dictate our movements. The next morning, we found an envelope shoved under the front door, his handwriting scrawled across the front. For her own good. My mother's hand trembled as she held it. I almost didn't want to see what was inside. But when she opened it, the contents made my breath catch in my throat and showed just how far he intended to go, even after being exposed. Shall I write the next chapter? Inside the envelope were photocopied documents, bank slips, and 2 crumpled tuition brochures. But what sent my stomach plummeting was the note on top, written in his jagged handwriting. You'll thank me one day. Independence isn't good for you. I'm making sure you don't throw your life away. At first glance, it seemed almost pitiful, like the ramblings of someone trying to justify the unjustifiable. But then I noticed the last line, underlined twice. If you try to open anything new, I'll make sure it's frozen. My mother gasped. He's threatening us. Her voice cracked, half disbelief, half horror. And that was the exact second it hit me. He wasn't just reacting to being exposed. He was preparing to escalate, to use whatever legal levers he still had as my guardian to choke every option I had left. I sat on the couch, gripping the letters, my mind flipping between rage and calculation. Frozen. He had already accessed the college fund, because he was the technical guardian when my father died. The bank never questioned it. Until I turned 18, he held a power that wasn't about love. It was about paperwork. And now, even though the family saw his mask crack, he could still weaponize that title against me. My mother sank into the chair across from me, staring down at her shaking hands. I let him sign everything years ago. Medical forms, financial guardianship, all of it. I thought it would make our lives easier. Her voice was hollow, edged with guilt. Then she looked at me, eyes wet. We have to undo this. We can't let him touch another penny. It was the first time she said we, not you. And I realized this battle wasn't mine alone anymore. That afternoon, the house turned into a crisis center. My aunt called a friend who worked at a bank, explaining in hushed tones what happened. I made copies of every statement, highlighting the transfers. For the first time, my mother searched the internet herself for legal steps to restrict a guardian's access. But in the middle of our frantic planning, my phone buzzed. A group chat notification. Family members were posting about the birthday speech, sharing whispers, asking if it were true that I had accused him of theft. Screenshots lit up my screen one after another, flooding me with dread. He was out there, spinning his story more aggressively than ever, painting himself as the victim of my hysterical imagination. More than stolen money was at stake now. He wanted my reputation, my credibility, and a stranglehold over my future. And as I scrolled through the swelling thread of relatives half believing his version, I knew this would no longer be solved quietly at a dining table. The fight was about to move into the open, where everyone had to pick sides. Shall I write the next chapter? By the time evening fell, the group chat was on fire. Cousins, uncles I hadn't spoken to in months, even distant relatives overseas, were chiming in, debating who to believe. Half of them parroted his lines. She's young, she's emotional, he's just trying to keep things stable. The other half stayed silent, their hesitation almost worse than outright disbelief. My hands shook scrolling through the flood, my face burning at emojis laughing at me like I was nothing more than a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. I wanted to smash the phone across the wall, but my aunt squeezed my shoulder and said, "Don't. Let them run their mouths. You've got the receipts, not them." Still, the humiliation dug deep. It was one thing to have him sneer in private, but seeing my future reduced to gossip fodder for people who had no idea what he'd done made me sick. Control. That was his obsession. He hadn't only taken the money. Now he wanted to dictate the story, the version of me the whole family would believe. My mother surprised me then. For days she'd been paralyzed by shame, but that night she finally snapped. She stood over the dining table where our pile of printouts and documents lay scattered and slammed her hand down. "Enough," she said, her voice raw but steady. "He's not stealing another thing from you. Or from me." Her eyes were locked onto mine. "We're going to the bank tomorrow morning. We'll flag every transaction. Then, we go to a lawyer." My breath caught. The word lawyer changed the temperature of the room. This wasn't about whispered allegations at family dinners anymore. This was moving into the realm of facts, notarized signatures, accountability. He'd mocked me for being too young to understand, but paper trails don't care about age. That night, I packed an envelope with everything I had, printed bank statements, screenshots of his notes, even photos I'd taken of the letter he shoved under our door. Proof. Cold. Irrefutable. For the first time, my fear twisted into adrenaline. But even as I lay down staring at the ceiling, a question gnawed at me. When all of this finally came crashing down, would my mother stand all the way with me, or flinch when she realized what breaking free from him would actually cost? Tomorrow, I would put the truth in black and white before someone who could make it count. And I knew he wouldn't let me do it quietly. Shall I write the next chapter?